We're calling all writers, storytellers and creators of tales of the paranormal and supernatural. Do you have a spine-tingling story that's too chilling to keep to yourself? If the answer is yes, then wherever you are in the world, the Haunted UK Fiction Podcast wants to hear from you. Whether you're a published author, an aspiring writer, or someone with a natural gift for storytelling, this is your chance to share your work with a global audience of listeners who crave the eerie, the unexplained, the otherworldly. We're looking for original fictional short stories or novellas with strong paranormal or supernatural themes. Your stories can be suspenseful, mysterious, atmospheric, terrifying, thought-provoking, even darkly magical. If your story is selected, we'll professionally narrate, record, mix, and master it into an audiobook-style format, then feature it on the show. You'll get a copy of the finished production to use however you like, and you'll retain full ownership of your work. There are no fees, no contracts, and no hidden jargon. Your story deserves to be heard. Whether it's a tale that's been haunting your notebook for years, or maybe something that you're finally ready to unleash, this is your chance to bring it to life. To submit your story for consideration, email us at hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. And don't forget to follow the show on Instagram at hauntedukfiction. Now sit back and enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to Haunted UK Fiction, a sister podcast to The Haunted UK, which features original flash fiction, short stories and novellas with paranormal themes. All stories you will hear were written by a collection of talented writers, authors and storytellers, both independent and professional. In today's episode, we'll be reading a tale of a haunting in Barcelona, Spain, titled Shadows in the Barri Gotic, which was sent in to us by Hale. Tim is a Liverpool native with a passion for storytelling that has spanned over 5 decades after his love of reading and writing was ignited early in primary school upon joining his first book club. A love of 1980s adventure books like The Famous Five eventually gave way to the fantasy worlds of Tolkien and later stories that fused crime, thriller, and the supernatural. He recently rekindled his writing journey, bringing stories and characters to life on the page, now influenced by his fascination with local legends and folklore, which he weaves into his work. The story you're about to hear, however, was influenced by an account his wife shared from her time living in Barcelona. So get comfortable, grab a little something to sip on, perhaps cuddle up under a blanket to help offset the chills coming your way, and let's dive into the story. The key felt heavy in Jane's palm as she turned it in the ancient lock, the metal grinding against metal with the particular screech of old Barcelona ironwork. The door swung open with a theatrical creak that made Terry laugh behind her. "Christ, it's like something out of a Gothic novel," he said, shouldering past her with the largest of their suitcases. All we need now are some bats and a hunchback." Jane stepped across the threshold into their new home, breathing in the smell of old stone and something else, something musty and indefinable that seemed to cling to the walls. The estate agent, Signor Morales, had warned them about the character of these old apartments in the Barri Gotic, but standing in the dim entrance hall with its worn terracotta tiles and yellowed walls, Jane felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders. "The light switch is just there, signore," Morales said in careful English, gesturing to a porcelain fixture that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Very authentic, you see. This building, she is from the 14th century. Much history here." The electric bulb cast a weak amber glow that seemed to make the shadows deeper rather than banish them. Jane followed the men into the main room, where tall, shuttered windows looked out onto the Carrera de la Pieta. Even in the October afternoon, the narrow medieval street below captured so little sunlight that the apartments across the way remained in perpetual twilight. "It's perfect," Terry declared, setting down the suitcase with a thud that echoed strangely in the high-ceilinged room. "Look at these beams, Jane. You can't buy character like this back in Birmingham." Jane nodded, though something about the apartment made her skin prickle. The walls were thick enough to muffle the sounds of the city, creating an odd sense of isolation despite being in the heart of Barcelona's oldest quarter. She walked to one of the windows and pushed open the heavy wooden shutters. The street below was barely wide enough for a single car, its cobblestones slick with the perpetual dampness that seemed to seep from the ancient stones. Across the narrow gap she could see into other apartments. Washing hung from iron balconies, television screens flickering blue in darkened rooms, the intimate details of lives lived in these vertical villages that rose like cliffs on either side of the medieval streets. "The deposit?" Signor Morales was saying, producing a sheaf of papers from his leather briefcase. 3 months in advance, as we discussed, and you understand, this building is very old. Sometimes there are, how do you say, peculiarities. The plumbing, the electricity. These old places, they have their moods." Terry was already reaching for his checkbook, eager to close the deal. At 28, he was 4 years older than Jane, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with enough persistence and charm. It was one of the things that had drawn her to him when they'd met at university, though lately she'd begun to wonder if his optimism was less endearing and more simply naive. "Peculiarities," she repeated. "What sort of peculiarities?" Morales waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, you know, old buildings settle. They make noises. The previous tenants, they were very sensitive people. Artists, you understand. They imagine things." "What kind of things did they imagine?" Jane pressed, but Morales was already ushering Terry toward the small table by the window to sign the papers. They spent the rest of the afternoon moving their belongings up the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing in the stone stairwell. The building had no elevator, and by the time they'd hauled their life up 3 flights, Jane felt as though she'd been climbing for hours. The other apartments they passed were silent, their doors closed tight. She wondered about their neighbours. Were they Catalans who had lived here for generations, or other expatriates, drawn like herself and Terry to the romantic notion of life in medieval Barcelona? That first evening, they ate takeaway Chinese food, sitting on the floor of their new living room, surrounded by boxes and the few pieces of furniture they'd managed to acquire. Terry had found a bottle of cava somewhere and insisted on toasting their new adventure. "To Barcelona," he said, raising his plastic cup. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Jane echoed, though the words felt hollow in the strange acoustics of the room. As night fell, the apartment seemed to change. The shadows that had been merely atmospheric in the afternoon grew deeper and more definite. Jane found herself glancing toward the corners of the room, certain she'd seen movement in her peripheral vision. The building settled around them with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like whispers. And somewhere in the walls, pipes gurgled with what might have been water, or might have been something else entirely. "Listen to that," Terry said, tilting his head toward the ceiling. "Sounds like the building's talking to us." Jane pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "It's just old plumbing." But as she lay in bed that first night, listening to Terry's steady breathing beside her, she wasn't so sure. The sounds seemed too rhythmic, too purposeful to be random settling. And beneath the familiar urban symphony of traffic and late-night voices from the streets below, she could swear she heard something else. A low murmur that might have been conversation in a language she couldn't identify. She woke once in the small hours, her heart pounding from a dream she couldn't remember. The bedroom was thick with darkness, the heavy shutters blocking out even the minimal streetlight from below. For a moment, she lay still, trying to orient herself with the unfamiliar room. Then she smelled it, the rich, distinctive scent of cigar smoke. Jane sat up, scanning the darkness. Terry was fast asleep, and she knew he didn't smoke. The smell was strong enough that it seemed to come from inside the room rather than drifting up from the streets. She slipped out of bed and made her way carefully to the window, pulling back the edge of the curtain to peer out. The street below was empty, lit only by a single lamp that cast more shadows than light. But the smell persisted, hanging in the air like an invisible presence. "Terry!" she whispered, but he only rolled over and continued sleeping. Jane stood by the window for a long time, waiting for the scent to fade. When it finally did, she wasn't sure if it had actually dissipated, or if she'd simply grown accustomed to it. She made her way back to bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and lay awake until dawn, trying to convince herself that it had been her imagination. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and exploration. Terry had found work teaching English at a language school near Plaza Catalunya, and Jane was looking for freelance translation work while she improved her Spanish. They spent their evenings walking the labyrinthine streets of the Barri Gotic, marvelling at the way the medieval city seemed to exist in layers. Roman stones forming the foundations of Gothic walls, which in turn supported Renaissance balconies and modern apartments. The neighbourhood revealed itself slowly, like a complex piece of music that required multiple listenings to fully appreciate. There was the daily rhythm of the locals, elderly women emerging in the mornings to shop at the tiny groceries tucked into ground-floor spaces that had been commercial premises for centuries. Children racing through the narrow passages on their way to school, the evening peso when entire families would emerge to stroll and socialize. But there was something else too, a sense of weight and watchfulness that Jane felt most strongly when she was alone in the apartment. It was as if the building itself was aware of her presence, cataloguing her movements and judging her somehow. She found herself speaking aloud when she was by herself, addressing the empty rooms as if they contained invisible listeners. "I'm just making some tea," she would say to the kitchen. "Don't mind me." The poltergeist activity began small. A book that wasn't where she'd left it. Kitchen cupboards that stood ajar despite her certainty that she'd closed them. At first, she blamed her own distraction. Moving to a new country was stressful after all, and she was still adjusting to the different rhythms of Spanish life. But the incidents grew more frequent and more unmistakable. One morning, she woke to find all the kitchen drawers pulled open to their fullest extent, their contents undisturbed, but the symbolism unmistakable. Something had been searching, examining, investigating their possessions in the night. "You must have forgotten to close them properly," Terry said when she showed him. "These old fixtures don't always catch the way you'd expect." Jane demonstrated the firm click each drawer made when properly closed. the resistance required to pull them open. Terry shrugged and headed off to work, leaving her alone with the growing uncertainty that they were not alone in the apartment. The incidents escalated. One afternoon, while she was working at the small desk they'd positioned by the living room window, every book on their makeshift bookshelf suddenly tumbled to the floor in rapid succession, as if an invisible hand had swept along the shelf. Jane jumped up, her heart hammering, and stared at the scattered volumes. Hemingway and Orwell, a Spanish phrasebook, the guidebooks they'd accumulated during their first weeks in the city. She was still kneeling on the floor, gathering books, when she heard it. A low chuckle that seemed to come from the corner of the room where the old armchair sat in perpetual shadow. Jane froze, a copy of Homage to Catalonia clutched in her hands. The laugh came again, warm and masculine, and definitely not coming from the street below. She slowly turned toward the chair, but it sat empty, its worn velvet upholstery undisturbed. "Hello?" she called out, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. "Is someone there?" The apartment absorbed her words without echo, the silence that followed more profound than simple quiet. Jane finished collecting the books with trembling hands, stacking them carefully on the shelf and weighing each one down with a small object. If they fell again, she wanted to know it wasn't because of any structural vibration. That evening, she tried to tell Terry about the incident, but he was full of stories from his new job, animated by the challenge of teaching English to Spanish teenagers who were more interested in British pop music than grammar. "The books just fell down," he said, already distracted by the football match he was trying to follow on their small television. "Maybe there was a truck going by. These old buildings are sensitive to vibration." Jane started to explain about the laugh, but the words died in her throat. How could she make him understand the quality of that sound? Intimate and knowing, as if whoever had made it was sharing a private joke at her expense. Instead, she made dinner and listened to Terry's plans for the weekend excursions to the beach at Barcelona, to the Gaudi houses in the Eixample, to the mountain Montjuic, where the city's fortress and museums offered panoramic views of the Mediterranean. His enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time they went to bed, Jane had almost convinced herself that she was simply adjusting to the strange acoustics and unfamiliar rhythms of their new home. But she woke again to the smell of cigar smoke. This time it was so strong that she was certain Terry must smell it too. She reached over to shake him awake, then stopped. The smoke seemed to be concentrated on her side of the bed, as if someone was sitting in the chair by the window, smoking and watching her sleep. Jane lay perfectly still, barely breathing, every sense straining to detect some other sign of presence. The building was quiet around them. No footsteps in the hallway, no voices from the neighborhood apartments, no traffic from the street below. But the smell of tobacco hung heavy in the air, expensive and distinctive, nothing like the cheap cigarettes she'd occasionally smelled on the streets. When she finally gathered the courage to look toward the chair, she saw nothing but shadows and the faint outline of furniture in the darkness. But the smoke lingered for nearly an hour, and she remained awake long after it faded, listening to the building breathe around them. In the morning, she opened all the windows and aired out the apartment, but Terry noticed nothing amiss. He kissed her goodbye and headed off to work, leaving her alone with her growing certainty that something in the apartment was trying to communicate with her. The revelation came gradually, built from small encounters and overhead conversations. Jane had begun frequenting a small cafe near the cathedral, partly for the excellent coffee, and partly because the elderly owner, Signora Martinez, spoke excellent English and seemed pleased to have someone to practice with. It was there that she met Carmen and Pau, a young Catalan couple who were fascinated to learn that she lived on Carrer de la Piat. That street has much history, Carmen said, her English careful but clear. My grandmother, she used to tell us stories about the war, about what happened in those buildings. What kind of stories? Jane asked, though something in her stomach tightened as she waited for the answer. Carmen and Pau exchanged a look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Pau leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were speaking English in a cafe where most of the other patrons were tourists. During the Civil War, he said, many of those apartments were used by the Republic. Safe houses, you understand. Places where people could hide, where messages could be passed. The Republicans were the good guys, right? Jane asked, her knowledge of Spanish history embarrassingly limited. It depends who you ask, Carmen said with a bitter smile. But yes, they were fighting against Franco, against fascism. My great-uncle, he was with them. Many Catalans were. What happened to them? Another look passed between the couple. Some escaped, Pau said finally. Some were captured. The citadel on Montjuic, it was used as a prison. Many who went there did not come back. Jane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Do you know anything specific about the buildings on my street? Carmen nodded slowly. There were stories about betrayals. Someone was passing information to the nationalists, to Franco's people. A whole network was rolled up, arrested in a single night. The safe houses were no longer safe. Do you know which buildings? The details were not spoken much after the war, too dangerous. But my grandmother, she said the worst betrayal came from within. Someone they trusted, someone who knew all the safe houses, all the people. Carmen's voice dropped to a whisper. She said his spirit never left the place where he lived, where he planned his treachery. Jane walked home through the winding streets in a daze, Carmen's words echoing in her mind. The narrow passages of the Barri Gotic seemed different now, charged with history and tragedy. Every doorway might have hidden desperate people, every window might have concealed watchers, every shadow might be holding secrets that were decades old, but still bleeding into the present. That evening, she tried again to tell Terry about her experiences, adding the historical context she'd learned from Carmen and Pau. But he was grading papers and only half listening, making encouraging noises without really engaging with what she was saying. It's fascinating stuff, he agreed absently. We should definitely visit some of the Civil War sites. There's supposed to be an excellent exhibition at the History Museum. Terry, I think our apartment might have been one of those safe houses. Very possible. These buildings were all residential then too. And I think something from that time is still there. This time, he looked up from his papers, pen poised over his student's essay about British television. What do you mean, still there? Jane took a deep breath. I think the apartment is haunted. Terry's expression shifted from distraction to concern. Janie, you've been under a lot of stress with the move. It's natural to feel unsettled in a new place, especially somewhere with so much atmosphere. This isn't about atmosphere. Books are moving by themselves. I keep smelling cigar smoke in the middle of the night. And today I heard someone laughing in the living room when I was alone. You heard someone laugh? Terry set down his pen and gave her his full attention for the first time in days. Jane, are you sure you're feeling all right? The stress of adapting to a new culture, learning a new language, it can play tricks on your mind. My mind is fine, Jane said, hearing the edge in her own voice. Something is happening in this apartment and I need you to believe me. Terry reached across the table and took her hand. I believe that you're experiencing something unsettling. But there's always a rational explanation. Old buildings make noises. Smells can linger in the walls for decades. And when you're already on edge, it's easy to misinterpret perfectly normal sounds. Jane pulled her hand away. So you think I'm imagining it? I think you're a sensitive person in an unfamiliar environment, and your mind is trying to make sense of things by creating patterns and narratives. It's completely normal. Jane stared at him, seeing for the first time the gulf that separated them. Terry lived in a world where every mystery had a logical solution, where the past stayed safely buried, where ghosts were nothing more than psychological projections. But Jane was beginning to understand that Barcelona was a city where the past refused to stay buried, where the history pressed through the stones and mortar like water through limestone, where the dead sometimes had unfinished business with the living. That night, she lay awake waiting. She didn't have to wait long. The smell came first, rich and complex, not just tobacco, but the specific scent of an expensive Cuban cigar. It filled the bedroom like a presence, and Jane found herself holding her breath, afraid to disturb whatever was sharing the space with them. Then she heard it, the soft creak of someone settling into the chair by the window. Jane's heart pounded so hard she was certain it would wake Terry, but he slept on undisturbed. Slowly, terrified of what she might see, but unable to stop herself, she turned her head to the window. A man sat in the chair. He was middle-aged, perhaps 50, with carefully pomaded hair and a neat moustache in the style of the 1930s. His suit was well-tailored, but old-fashioned, with the high-waisted trousers and broad lapels she'd seen in photographs from before the war. In his right hand, he held a lit cigar, the cherry glowing orange in the darkness. But it was his expression that made Jane's blood freeze. He was looking directly at her, with eyes that were intelligent and calculating, and completely without warmth. His mouth was curved in a slight smile that suggested he was enjoying some private joke, and when he realized she could see him, the smile widened. He raised the cigar to his lips, took a long draw, and released the smoke in a perfect ring that dissipated before it reached the ceiling. Then he leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to speak. Jane tried to scream, but no sound would come. She tried to move, to shake Terry awake, but her body wouldn't respond. She could only lie there, paralyzed by terror, as the man in the chair studied her with those cold, amused eyes. When she finally managed to blink, he was gone. The chair sat empty, but the smell of cigar smoke lingered for another hour. In the morning, Jane could barely function. She moved through the apartment like a sleepwalker, jumping at every shadow, checking and rechecking the locks on the doors and windows. When Terry asked if she was all right, she just nodded and claimed she hadn't slept well. How could she tell him that she'd seen a ghost? That a man from the 1930s had been sitting in their bedroom, smoking and watching her with malevolent amusement? Terry would think she was having a breakdown, and perhaps she was. But when she returned to the cafe that afternoon, she found Carmen and Pau waiting for her, their expressions grave. "We've been asking questions," Carmen said without preamble, "about your building, about what happened there during the war." Jane felt her hands begin to shake. "What did you find out?" Pau pulled out a notebook, consulted his careful handwriting. "The building at your address was definitely used as a safe house. The network was run by a man named Eduard Vinyals, a teacher who had connections throughout the city. They hid people, passed messages, coordinated with other Republican cells." "What happened to them?" "In November 1937, the entire network was betrayed," Carmen continued. "Someone gave the locations of all the safe houses to the nationalist forces. 17 people were arrested in a single night." "Including Eduard Vinyals?" "Yes, he was taken to the Citadel Montjuic. He died there under interrogation." Jane felt the blood drain from her face. "And the betrayer?" Carmen and Pau exchanged another look. "That is the interesting part," Pau said. The betrayer was never identified officially, but there were rumours, stories that were passed down in families. They said it was someone close to Vinyals, someone he trusted completely. Someone who had access to all the safe houses, Carmen added, who knew all the people involved. Do you know anything about this person? What he looked like? Only stories, Pau said, but they say he was a well-dressed man, middle-aged, from a good family. Someone who believed that Franco would bring order to Spain, who thought the Republicans were dangerous radicals. And after the betrayal? He disappeared. Some say he was killed by other Republicans seeking revenge. Others say he fled to nationalist territory, but there was another story. Pau hesitated. What story? My grandfather, he knew some of the people who were arrested. He said the betrayer had been living in the same building as one of the safe houses, and after the war, no one could stay in that apartment for long. They said he still haunted the place, watching, waiting. Jane's teacup rattled against its saucer, and she realized her hands were shaking uncontrollably. What did he look like? This betrayer? Carmen consulted her own notes. The descriptions are all similar. A man of about 50, always well-dressed, with a moustache in the fashion of the time. And he was known for smoking expensive cigars, even during the war when they were hard to find. Jane closed her eyes, seeing again that cold smile, those calculating eyes. I think, she said quietly, I think I've met him. Over the next hour, she told Carmen and Pau everything. The strange incidents, the cigar smoke, the man in the chair. They listened without skepticism, nodding as if her story confirmed something they had already suspected. You must leave that place, Carmen said when Jane had finished. This man, his spirit, he is not at peace. He's still watching, still betraying. You're not safe there. But why me? Why can I see him when Terry can't? Sometimes the dead choose who can see them, Pau said. Maybe because you are a woman, like the women he betrayed. Maybe because you are foreign, like the people he helped hunt down. Or maybe simply because you are sensitive to such things. That evening, Jane tried one more time to convince Terry that they needed to leave the apartment. She told him everything Carmen and Pau had discovered, describing the man she'd seen in precise detail, begging him to at least acknowledge the possibility that something supernatural was occurring. Terry listened patiently, then shook his head. Jane, I know you believe all this, but you have to understand how it sounds. You're telling me that our apartment is haunted by a Civil War-era ghost who smokes cigars and moves books around? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And you want us to break our lease and find a new place based on some folklore and your experiences? Yes. Terry sighed and pulled her close. I love you, and I'm worried about you. This obsession with ghosts and history isn't healthy. Maybe you should talk to someone. Get some help adjusting to the move. Jane pulled away from his embrace. You think I need a psychiatrist? I think you need support. Moving to a foreign country is a huge life change, and you're clearly struggling more than I realized. I'm struggling because there's a malevolent spirit in our bedroom and my boyfriend thinks I'm crazy. I don't think you're crazy, I think you're under stress, and your mind is playing tricks on you. Jane stared at him, understanding finally that no amount of evidence would convince him. Terry inhabited a universe governed by logic and reason, where the dead stayed buried and the past was just history. He would never be able to see what she could see, feel what she could feel. Fine, she said. You don't have to believe me, but I'm not spending another night in this apartment. She packed a bag and walked out into the narrow streets of the Barri Gotic, finding a small hotel near the port where she could think clearly without the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders. From her window, she could see the lights of Mount Juic rising above the city, and she thought about Edouard Vignals and the others who had died there, betrayed by someone they trusted. Terry called repeatedly, but she didn't answer. She needed time to decide what to do next, how to move forward when the person she loved couldn't or wouldn't accept her reality. On her third day at the hotel, Carmen called. "Pau has found something," she said. "Something you need to see." They met at the cafe, where Pau spread out photocopies of documents he'd obtained from the city's archives. The papers were in Catalan, but he translated as he pointed to relevant passages. "This is a police report from 1938, he said. "It describes the discovery of a body in an apartment on Carrer de la Piat. The man had been killed by a single gunshot to the head." Jane leaned closer, studying the faded text. "Who was he?" "The name given is Francesc Molins. He was identified as a businessman who had been living in the building since 1935. But look at this description." Pau pointed to a section of the report. "Male, approximately 50 years of age, well-dressed with a distinctive moustache. The investigating officer noted that the apartment contained expensive furnishings and several boxes of Cuban cigars." Jane felt her pulse quicken. So he was killed? The betrayer was killed? It appears so. The report speculates that he was executed by Republican operatives, seeking revenge for his role in the network's exposure. But if he's dead, why is he still haunting the apartment? Carmen leaned across the table. Sometimes the dead cannot rest when they have committed great sins, especially sins of betrayal. In Catalan folklore, traitors are condemned to remain in the place of their treachery until they make amends. But how can he make amends? The people he betrayed are dead. "That is the tragedy," Pau said quietly. "He cannot make amends, so he cannot rest. He's trapped in that apartment, reliving his betrayal for eternity." Jane thought about the man she'd seen, the cold amusement in his eyes. He didn't seem tormented. He seemed pleased with himself. "Some spirits lose their humanity over time," Carmen explained. "They become focused only on the act that binds them to the earth. This Francesc Molins, he may no longer remember the people he betrayed, only the act of betrayal itself." That night, Jane made her decision. She would return to the apartment one final time, not to stay, but to confront whatever was living there in the shadows of history. She owed it to Edouard Vignals and the others who had died because of Francesc Molins. And she owed it to herself, to face her fear rather than run from it. She waited until late evening, when she knew Terry would be asleep. The building was dark as she climbed the familiar stairs, her footsteps echoing in the stone stairwell. The apartment key felt cold in her hand as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The living room was exactly as she'd left it, but the atmosphere was charged with expectation, as if the apartment had been waiting for her return. Jane walked to the centre of the room and spoke clearly into the darkness. "I know who you are," she said. "Francesc Molins. I know what you did." The response was immediate. Books began tumbling from the shelves again, but this time with violent force, as if hurled by an angry hand. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Jane's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. "You betrayed people who trusted you," she continued, raising her voice above the sound of objects crashing to the floor. "You sent innocent people to die." A low growl filled the room, seeming to come from the walls themselves. The kitchen drawers burst open with explosive force, their contents spilling across the floor with deafening clatter. "They died because of you," Jane shouted. "Edouard Vignals died because of you. And you're trapped here because of what you did. You can't rest, can you? You can't find peace." The poltergeist activity stopped abruptly, leaving the apartment in sudden, profound silence. Then Jane smelled the familiar scent of cigar smoke, and she turned toward the chair by the window. Francesc Mullins sat there as before, but this time his expression was different. The cold amusement was gone, replaced by something that might have been anguish. He looked older somehow, his face lined with decades of accumulated regret. "I can see you," Jane said more quietly. "I know you're here, and I know you can't leave." The ghost of Francesc Mullins raised his cigar to his lips, but his hand was shaking. When he tried to speak, no sound emerged, only the movement of lips forming words that the air couldn't carry. "You're sorry," Jane said, understanding suddenly. "You're trying to say you're sorry." The ghost nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. He then began to fade, becoming translucent, his edges blurring until he was little more than a suggestion of human form. "But being sorry isn't enough," Jane continued. "The people you betrayed are dead. You can apologize, but you can't undo what you did." Francesc Mullins flickered like a candle in the wind, and Jane realized she was seeing the true nature of his haunting. Not malevolent presence, but eternal remorse. He was trapped not by sin, but by the impossibility of redemption, doomed to exist in the space between guilt and forgiveness, neither fully alive nor properly dead. The ghost disappeared entirely, leaving only the lingering scent of tobacco and the sound of Jane's own breathing in the silent apartment. She spent the rest of the night cleaning up the scattered books and kitchen implements, putting the apartment back in order for Terry. As dawn broke over the narrow streets of the Barri Gotic, she packed the last of her belongings and wrote a letter explaining her decision to leave Barcelona. She couldn't stay in a place where the past bled so readily into the present, where history lived in the stones and mortar of every building. And she couldn't stay with someone who refused to acknowledge that some mysteries couldn't be solved by logic and rationality alone. Carmen and Pau helped her find a train ticket to Paris, where she had friends who could help her start over. As the train pulled away from Estacio de Sant, Jane watched the city recede into the distance, the medieval towers of the Barri Gotic, the distinctive silhouette of the Sagrada Familia, the fortress of Montjuic, where so many had died for their beliefs. She never saw Terry again, though she heard through mutual friends that he stayed in Barcelona for several more months before returning to England. He told people that Jane had suffered a nervous breakdown, that the stress of living abroad had proved too much for her sensitive nature. But Jane knew better. She had encountered something in that apartment, on Carrera de la Piat, that challenged everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality. She'd looked into the eyes of history itself and seen the weight of human choices, the price of betrayal, the impossibility of undoing the past. Years later, settled in London and working as a translator of Spanish texts, she would sometimes catch the scent of cigar smoke in unexpected places, on a crowded tube platform, in the stacks of the British Library, walking through the narrow streets of the city where medieval foundations still shaped the modern streetscape. And she would think of Francesc Mullins, trapped forever in that apartment in the Barri Gotic, smoking his expensive cigars and contemplating the irreversible consequences of his choices. She never returned to Barcelona, but the city had changed her forever. She'd learned that some places hold their history too close, that the past sometimes refuses to stay buried, and that love isn't always enough to bridge the gap between different ways of seeing the world. In her dreams, she still walked the narrow streets of the Gothic quarter, past the ancient cathedral and through the shadows cast by buildings that had witnessed centuries of human drama. And sometimes, in those dreams, she would catch a glimpse of a well-dressed man from the 1930s, sitting alone in a darkened window, smoking a cigar, and waiting for forgiveness that would never come. The apartment on Carrère de la Piat remained vacant for several months after Jane and Terry's departure. When new tenants finally moved in, a young Spanish couple with no knowledge of the building's history, they lasted less than a week. They complained to the landlord about the smell of cigar smoke, about books that moved by themselves, about the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. The cycle continued as it had for decades, and as it would for decades to come. Because some sins echo through time, and some spirits are condemned to repeat their stories until the very stones forget their names. But the stones of Barcelona forget nothing. They remember the weight of Roman legions, the prayers of medieval monks, the blood of civil war, and the tears of those who loved and lost in the shadow of history. They remember Francesc Molins and Edward Vinyals, the betrayer and the betrayed, locked forever in their dance of guilt and innocence. That brings us to the end of this episode. We truly hope you enjoyed this spine-tingling historical haunting tale. If you would like to hear more from Tim Hale, be sure to follow him on social media as he's working on The Haunting of the Punch Bowl, a novella based on the legends surrounding a local ancient pub and church located not far from where he grew up in North Merseyside. We also have another story of his to share next season. Social media and contact information for Tim can be found in the show notes. If you have an original story that would send a chill down our spines and you would like to submit it for review, simply send it into hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. That's hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. Until the next time, stay safe and take care.